So, you're not a criminal. Not really. You haven't robbed anyone. You haven't murdered anyone. You haven't even said anything particularly heretical in public. You've just been alive in medieval Europe, which is dangerous behaviour in itself. Maybe you stepped on someone's foot at the market. Maybe your chimney smoked the wrong way. Maybe your goat looked at someone sideways. Or maybe you have a mole in a weird spot, and someone's grandmother had a dream about a mole once, and now you're obviously in league with Satan. It doesn't take much. Accusation isn't about what you did. It's about what someone thinks you might have done, or would do if left unsupervised. It starts as a whisper, then a glance, then a conversation between two people who are very confident in their extremely limited understanding of theology, law, and goat behaviour. You might have just been standing near a sick cow when it keeled over. That's not your fault, but cows are expensive. You are not. And it's much easier to blame the weird-looking neighbour than to accept that livestock sometimes just dies. Or maybe someone wants your land. That patch of swampy nothing behind your house, it's worth nothing, unless someone else wants to grow cabbage on it. And nothing clears up a land dispute faster than a heresy charge and a conveniently timed vision from God. Even children can accuse you, especially if you've ever told one to stop throwing mud at your door. Suddenly little Simon is crying in the town square, saying he saw you dancing naked with a ghost. People believe him. He's 8. He wouldn't lie, except he absolutely would. And he's been doing it all year. Don't bother saying you're innocent. That's what guilty people say. And you're suspiciously calm. Or maybe you're too panicked. Or not panicked enough. There is no correct emotional setting here. You are always reacting incorrectly, which makes you look even more guilty. Sometimes the accusation comes from the church. Maybe you didn't attend Mass 3 Sundays in a row. Maybe you've been seen talking to travellers. Maybe your beard is the wrong length. Whatever it is, the local priest has decided your soul needs purifying, by force if necessary. Sometimes the accusation is strategic. You were a witness to something inconvenient, a bribe, a crime, a poorly hidden affair. Rather than let you talk, someone talks first, about you, loudly, repeatedly, with dramatic hand gestures. And just like that, you're no longer a witness. You're the problem. Even illness can be suspicious. You get a cough. Someone else gets a rash. A baby dies. People remember that your eyes are a bit too green. Green historically being the colour of sin, jealousy, and other things that make villagers nervous. Suddenly your cough is an omen, your sneeze is a curse, and your goose is very much cooked. And heaven forbid you're a woman. Then you're automatically suspicious, especially if you're unmarried, outspoken, educated, or, God help you, over the age of 40 and still alive. That combination screams witch to the average medieval brain, which is mostly beer and superstition. It doesn't even have to be personal. Sometimes the town just needs someone to blame. The harvest failed. The river flooded. The baker's wife had twins with suspiciously red hair. The whole village is tense and itchy, and nothing soothes a panicked crowd like pointing at someone and saying, "That one, get them." There are no appeals, no affidavits, no one checks if you have an alibi, no one cares if you do. The mere fact that someone accused you is considered evidence enough that something must be wrong. If you're truly innocent, then God will protect you, right? Right. But God's been pretty quiet lately, and the local magistrate is very loud, especially when surrounded by angry farmers and unpaid soldiers. You're not a criminal, you're a scapegoat, and no one ever stops to ask if the goat did anything wrong. So here you are, not a thief, not a killer, just an unfortunate soul who made eye contact at the wrong time, in the wrong town, during the wrong moon cycle. And now you're on trial for existing in public without divine permission. Okay, you've been accused. You're still reeling, still confused, still wondering how I tripped and fell into a sheep, turned into witchcraft by unnatural embrace. But don't worry. Now comes the part where they present the evidence. That's what courts do, right? Evidence. That's adorable, because here in the medieval justice system, evidence is a flexible term. It might be something someone claims to have seen. It might be something someone dreamed. It might just be that the wind blew strangely near your house on a Tuesday, and now a man with a hat made of fox thinks you're consorting with demons. Let's start with the classic, hearsay, the backbone of every solid medieval case. My cousin's neighbour heard from a monk who once saw her buying garlic at the wrong stall. That's practically a signed confession. There's no need to verify the source is confidence. Then there are signs, physical signs, strange birthmarks, unusual freckles, a mole on your shoulder shaped vaguely like a lizard. That's a witch's mark. A scar you got from falling off a ladder 5 years ago. Obvious branding from your infernal master. Limp when it rains. Clearly, demonic arthritis. Animals can be evidence. Did your cat look at someone wrong? That's a familiar. A toad sat near your door? Sorcery. A bird flew over your house? Cawed once, then left? That's obviously a message from hell. It's amazing anyone kept pets at all. Most people just stopped naming their livestock to avoid being burned at the stake over a particularly opinionated chicken. Object 2. Got herbs hanging in your home? Must be spell work. A book you can read? Suspicious. Especially if it's not the Bible. A locked box? That's clearly cursed. A perfectly normal box that creaks? Haunted. A creaky box that doesn't creak anymore? Too haunted. And don't forget the ever-reliable testimony from someone who hates you. Jealous neighbour? Bitter ex? That guy whose rake you borrowed and never returned? All extremely credible witnesses in a system where motive and bias are considered charming quirks, not reasons to throw out the case. Then there's spectral evidence. That's right. Someone dreams about you doing something evil, and that dream is now legally relevant. I saw her riding a cow backwards while chanting in Latin in my dream. Well, that settles it. You were obviously astral projecting to spread plague. Very rude of you. Children are also popular witnesses, mostly because they're loud, creative, and unburdened by facts. Little Agnes said you floated in a puddle once. She also thinks frogs are spies. But no one's asking for consistency. They're asking for spectacle, and a crying child always sells better than a thoughtful adult. Even the weather gets involved. If a storm hits after you're accused, that's confirmation. If it doesn't storm, that's the devil hiding the evidence. Heads, you're guilty. Tails, you're hiding something. There's no winning here, just varying speeds of losing. You can try to produce an alibi, of course. Say you were tending sheep, or praying, or bleeding quietly in your cottage, but no one believes you. If you're not guilty, why are you defending yourself? Sounds suspicious. Only the guilty get so defensive, and the innocent, but mostly the guilty. Then comes the character witnesses, which is to say, the people who don't like you, now lined up to tell the court how strange you've always been. She once laughed during a thunderstorm. He talks to his onions. She sings to her goats and the milk curdled. It's less legal proceeding, more public roast. Every cough, twitch, awkward silence, or wrong answer is evidence. Blink too much, lying, don't blink enough, possessed, cry, you're manipulating. Don't cry, cold-hearted. The only correct facial expression is panicked and vaguely damp. And even that's risky. And remember, if they really need evidence, they can just make it. Confessions can be encouraged. Items can be discovered. Marks can be noticed. The system works very efficiently when truth is optional and fear's mandatory. So there you sit, accused by the sky, the sheep, your birthmark, and the guy whose wife once said you had a strange energy. The court nods solemnly. The priest hums. The crowd murmurs. And just like that, you've been proven guilty by everything but facts. Welcome to medieval forensics, where dreams are depositions, goats are hostile witnesses, and the only real crime is being weird near other people. Your trial begins with yelling, not the passionate, dramatic kind you see in courtroom dramas, more the confused, overlapping sort that happens when no one actually knows what a trial is supposed to look like. There's a judge, there's a priest, there's a crowd. That's all the ingredients they need, apparently. You stand awkwardly in the middle of whatever space they've deemed court today. A church hall, a barn, the muddy side of a hill. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you're surrounded by people who already assume you're guilty and who showed up mostly for the entertainment. You try to find the part of this that feels official. There isn't one. A man in robes, possibly the judge, possibly just someone who found robes, clears his throat and begins shouting in what might be Latin or might be his lunch order. Either way, it's not for your benefit. You recognise your name, badly mispronounced. That's your cue to tremble slightly and look as harmless as possible. No one tells you what to do. There's no defence counsel. No helpful clerk to whisper advice. Just you, standing there with your guilty face, which seems to be your normal face. The judge scowls at it anyway. You try to look innocent, which is difficult when you're surrounded by people who think blinking too often is suspicious. Witnesses are called. These are people you've never met, or worse, people you have met and now regret it. One claims you muttered something while staring at their ox. Another swears they saw you picking herbs with intent. A third simply says you make them uncomfortable, and the judge nods solemnly. You attempt to speak, to explain, to defend yourself. But the moment you open your mouth, three things happen. The crowd starts muttering, the priest begins a chant, and someone in the back throws a cabbage core at your feet. You're told to be quiet and let the process unfold. You have no idea what that process is. Sometimes scripture is read. Sometimes laws are recited. None of them make sense. A man with an ink-stained tunic drones from a parchment that may be older than the building you're in. Words like maleficium, infidelis, and suspicio are tossed out like confetti, and every time someone hears one, they gasp and cross themselves, just to be safe. You can't tell if the trial is going well or badly. You suspect it's both. The judge looks bored. The priest looks hungry. Someone near the front is napping. No one seems particularly concerned with your innocence, only whether this whole thing wraps up before dinner. If you show fear, they call it guilt. If you stay calm, they call it unnatural. Smile, suspicious, frown, sullen, look confused, clearly hiding something. There is no winning posture. You start to wonder if they'll accuse your eyebrows of witchcraft next. There's an emphasis on confession. Everyone keeps asking if you have one. You say no. They ask again, louder. You say no, but more nervously. They ask again, this time while moving closer with a suspiciously hot piece of iron. The suggestion is clear. Confess now, or confess noisier later. At one point, a monk offers to let you unburden your soul. This is not an offer, it's bait. You say nothing. The monk frowns like you've just kicked a saint. The judge murmurs with the priest. You catch the words ordeal and testing. Neither sound pleasant. The crowd shifts. Someone shouts something about devils. Someone else counters with a chicken. You lose track of what's happening, but you're pretty sure the chicken is winning. The legal argument devolves into shouting and prayer. Again, hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Eventually, the judge stands. He waves a hand like he's dismissing a stray thought. The priest nods. The crowd leans in. A verdict is declared, sort of. You don't hear it clearly over the collective "ooh" from the audience, but a guard grabs your arm, and that feels conclusive. Was this justice? Hard to say. It involved some robes, some yelling, and a lot of things that looked like ceremony, but felt like theatre. All you know for sure is that you're now officially something. Guilty, cursed, or due for further testing. Possibly all three. And as you're dragged away, someone in the crowd cheers. Someone else hawks phlegm in your direction. And the judge sits back down like nothing happened at all. Another trial over. Another soul judged. Another perfectly ordinary day in the medieval justice system. Behind every terrible medieval trial is a man with a large hat, a permanent scowl, and the faint scent of pickled onions clinging to his robes. This is the judge. Your judge. The man who will decide whether you walk free, get dunked in a river, or are sentenced to death by symbolic vegetables. He is not qualified. He is not sober. He is not even fully awake. Judges in medieval courts weren't exactly drawn from the top legal minds of their generation. They were often landowners, petty nobles, church officials, or just the local guy with the fewest lice and the loudest voice. The bar for entry was low. The bar for competence was buried beneath it. Your judge has no legal training. What he has is confidence and a very old family seal. He likes to stamp on things. He claims to have studied law. He hasn't. What he studied was a pamphlet titled 10 Commandments and how to ignore them selectively. He read the first 2 lines, spilled wine on the rest, and called it a day. He doesn't write anything down. He has a scribe for that, a 14-year-old with ink-stained fingers and a stutter who's mostly just guessing what Latin sounds like. When your judge hears something he doesn't like, he interrupts. When he hears something he doesn't understand, he interrupts louder. Justice to this man is a matter of instinct. He looks at you. He listens to the wind. He takes a long sip from a suspiciously ornate goblet, and then he frowns deeply, as if your existence personally offended his mother. That's the deliberation process. He smells like dried sweat, sour wine, and ceremonial regret. You can tell how the trial is going based on how red his face gets. Slightly pink, mild irritation, deep maroon. He's already planning your execution and trying to remember if he still owns a ceremonial axe. At least once he's sentenced an animal, probably a pig, maybe a cow. It broke into someone's garden, ate a turnip, and was declared guilty of theft and moral corruption. A small scaffold was built. The pig was hanged. The village applauded. The judge felt very proud. He likes to quote laws no one has heard of. According to the Edict of St. Godfrey, paragraph 17, line 2, he'll begin, before mumbling something about grain storage and the wrath of heaven. These laws do not exist. No one dares say so. Every now and then he nods off. Mid-trial, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, chin tucked into his collar, like a disappointed turtle. When he wakes, he pretends he was meditating on divine justice. Then he bangs something heavy and declares a ruling, often unrelated to the current case. He is deeply offended by questions. If you ask for clarification, he narrows his eyes like you just proposed seducing the church bell. If you protest your innocence, he calls it insolence. If you remain silent, he calls it guilt. The only winning strategy is to burst into tears and hope he's in a sentimental mood. Sometimes he flips a coin under the table, sometimes he rolls dice. Once he allegedly made a judgment based on the pattern of mould growing on his cheese. These are rumours, but not unbelievable ones. He has big sentences, people based on dreams energy. His robes are impressive, in the way that a faded, wine-stained curtain might be impressive if you squint. They trail in mud. They occasionally catch fire. The embroidery is mostly loose thread, and one deeply unfortunate depiction of a lion that looks more like a goat with anxiety. He speaks with great authority, but only when others are watching. Alone, he mostly mutters to himself and tries to remember which trial is which. Once, he sentenced a man to 10 lashes for eyebrow heresy, which no one understood but everyone clapped for anyway. The judge answers to no one. He was appointed by someone important, usually a cousin, a bishop, or a distant uncle who owed him money. He's untouchable, he knows it, and he's bored. Which is bad news for you, because bored judges tend to get creative. And at the end of it all, when your fate is declared and the crowd begins to murmur, your judge leans back in his chair, sighs contentedly, and pours himself another drink. Justice has been served. The definition of justice remains unclear, but he feels good about it. and that's what matters, apparently. Legal defence in the Middle Ages is, let's call it hands-on, as in the hands are yours, the mouth is yours, and the panic is entirely yours. You're not just the defendant, you're also your own legal team, public relations manager, and emotional support animal. Good luck with that. There's no barrister sweeping into the courtroom with a dramatic cape and a stack of clever objections. No one leans over to whisper legal strategy in your ear. There's no one at your side but fear, poor hygiene, and maybe your cousin Gregor, who is legally considered a turnip in 4 jurisdictions. Lawyers did technically exist in some places at some times, but not for people like you. If you were a noble, a bishop, or someone whose last name came with land and a coat of arms, sure. Maybe. You'd get a representative. But you're not that. You're just a dirt-covered nobody with a suspicious mole and a shaky voice. Even if you begged for counsel, the court would stare at you like you'd just asked to summon a demon. Why would you need help if you're innocent? What do you have to hide? Real truth speaks for itself. And if it doesn't, well, that's probably your fault. So now you're standing alone in front of a scowling judge, a very entertained crowd, and a priest who keeps muttering prayers loud enough for everyone to hear. You're told to make your defence. They mean now, on the spot, preferably without stuttering. You open your mouth, words fall out, the wrong ones. You try to explain that you weren't near the sick cow, that your herbs are for soup, and that you have never once communed with a frog intentionally. Halfway through, you forget what day it is. You mention your alibi, your neighbour, who is unfortunately also your accuser. The judge interrupts. The priest yawns. The crowd starts whispering. You're not sure if they're impressed or preparing to light something on fire. Either way, your argument isn't going over well. You appeal to reason. That was your first mistake. You try logic. Why would I curse a field I rely on for food? Excellent point. No one cares. Someone in the front row mumbles that that's exactly what a devil servant would say. The priest nods. You're losing momentum. There's no cross-examination, no calling witnesses on your behalf, no opportunity to present evidence, because that would imply the court cares about reality. You just talk until the judge tells you to stop, or until you say something dumb enough to be taken as a confession. Desperation sets in. You start telling personal stories. That time you helped a lost child find their goat. That time you donated bread to the church. You start crying, or laughing, or both. The judge looks annoyed. The priest starts praying louder. Someone throws a turnip core again. In a last-ditch effort, you try to quote scripture. You fumble the line. Instead of Psalm 23, you recite a fragment of something that sounds like a bakery receipt. The priest gasps. The judge grimaces. A child screams. You may have just committed theological slander. There are no rules to fall back on, no precedents to cite, no appeals to a higher court. The best-case scenario is surviving the day with your limbs intact. The worst-case scenario involves boiling water and a very serious monk with a bucket. You realise, too late, that you were never supposed to win this. The trial is a formality, a performance, a deeply unfunny comedy where your suffering is the punchline. You're not here to convince them of your innocence. You're here to provide closure and ideally entertainment. When it's over, the judge waves dismissively. The priest stops chanting. The crowd goes quiet. Your defence has been noted. It will be forgotten. You are led away, still muttering something about soup herbs, and the next trial begins. Probably with the same results. No lawyer, no defence, just you, the mob, and the deafening sound of medieval silence where justice should have been. Now that your defence has failed, spectacularly, publicly, and with only minor vegetable injuries, it's time for the court to do what it does best. Shrug off responsibility and let God decide. Enter the trial by ordeal. A process so sensible, so elegant, so deeply stupid, it could only have been invented by people who thought illness came from sneezing demons. The logic is simple. Since God is all-knowing and just, he will intervene during your trial. Meaning, if you're innocent, he'll protect you. If you're guilty, he'll let the laws of physics ruin your day. It's a foolproof system, provided you're a fan of pain and divine ambiguity. One of the most popular ordeals? The hot iron. You're handed a red-hot chunk of metal, not for long, just long enough to cook your skin. Then your hand is wrapped up for a few days. If it heals cleanly, you're innocent. If it festers, you're guilty. Also, if you scream too much, flinch, or faint, still guilty. God doesn't like cowards, apparently. Another crowd pleaser, trial by water. You're tied up and dropped into a river. If you sink, congratulations, you're innocent. Also, possibly dead. If you float, that means you've been rejected by the purifying waters of God and are thus guilty. So you drown Katsiksi good. You survive Pixis evil. It's less a trial, more a soggy lose-lose situation with an enthusiastic audience. Witch suspects get the bonus version of this one. It's called Swimming the Witch, and it's the same thing, but with more shouting and a stronger rope. Women were especially vulnerable here. If they floated, it meant they had unnatural buoyancy. Witchcraft. If they sank, well, tough luck, Agnes. Guess God just needed a new choir member. There's also the boiling water ordeal. A cauldron is filled with bubbling water, because fire isn't dramatic enough on its own. A stone or ring is tossed in. You, the accused, are asked to plunge your hand in and retrieve it. Yes, that's the test. If your arm turns into soup, you're guilty. If it somehow doesn't, miracle. Innocent. Also unlikely. Let's not forget trial by fire. Sometimes you had to walk a set number of paces while holding a flaming object, or walk barefoot across burning ploughshares. The goal was to see if your feet blistered, which they did, every time, because they were feet, on fire. But if they blistered too much, then clearly you had something to hide. Some ordeals were more symbolic, like eating sacred bread. Sounds pleasant, right? Except if you choked on it, it meant you were guilty. If you didn't choke, maybe you were innocent, or just better at chewing. There's no medical nuance here, just a strong belief that God micromanages digestion. The deeper horror is that these weren't considered punishments, they were tests, designed not to hurt you, though they absolutely did, but to let divine truth shine through your bubbling flesh, or your oddly buoyant corpse. This wasn't cruelty, it was theology, with smoke and audience participation. The whole village showed up for ordeal day. Everyone loved a good spectacle. There'd be praying, chanting, gawking, probably snacks. Children would sit on barrels to watch you scald your hand, while local clergy explained that this was, in fact, justice. The entertainment value was high. The acquittal rate was low. Sometimes you were given a choice, ordeal or confession, which is like choosing between getting stabbed in the gut or punched in the throat. Confession usually meant a lesser punishment, like imprisonment or branding, but also meant admitting guilt you didn't have. The ordeal, meanwhile, gave you a shot at proving your innocence by being violently assaulted by kitchen implements. If you survived, people would nod gravely. God has spoken, they'd say, as you held up your mangled, semi-cooked hand and tried not to cry in front of the priest. You'd still probably be fined, exiled, or stared at weirdly forever. But hey, not dead. So that's a win. If you failed the ordeal, meaning if you reacted like a human being to boiling metal or drowning, then the verdict was clear. Guilty. The crowd would mutter things about justice and divine will as they slowly gathered rope or firewood or sharpened something ominously. Church officials would sometimes try to moderate this process, especially later in the medieval period, but not by much. They didn't eliminate ordeals, they just made them more orderly, which is to say the water was blessed, the iron was weighed, and the screaming was better documented. Eventually, ordeals started falling out of favour, but only because courts found more efficient ways to ruin your life. Until then, this was the gold standard for judgment, pain, spectacle, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the laws of nature would take a coffee break and let you live. So yes, your fate came down to heat, water, fire, or bread. Trial by ordeal, where the truth burns, floats, festers, or chokes you to death. Justice, medieval style. When shouting didn't work, Latin failed, and boiling your hand didn't settle things. Medieval courts had one last, gloriously stupid trick up their sleeve. Trial by combat. That's right. If we can't agree on whether you're guilty, we'll let you and your accuser beat the truth out of each other with sticks. Problem solved. The logic here was divine. Literally, the belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous, that the innocent would triumph, that holy justice would guide your sword arm, even if that sword was technically a stick and your arm was already broken from a previous arrest attempt. Trial by combat wasn't reserved for soldiers or nobles. In theory, anyone could invoke it. In practice, you usually only got the option if you were of decent standing, which meant literate, landed, or lucky. But sometimes, just sometimes, a peasant got to swing for their freedom. Badly. If you were accused and insisted on your right to trial by combat, the court would nod solemnly. Then they'd match you against your accuser. If that accuser happened to be a knight in full-plate mail with a lifetime of sword training, well, sucks to be you. But fairness isn't part of the equation. You got a weapon, not necessarily a good one. If you were lucky, a club or a sword. If not, something more symbolic. A wooden pole, a farming tool, maybe a rock on a rope. Meanwhile, your opponent arrived wearing armour worth more than your entire village, and holding a weapon that probably had a name and backstory. The fight took place in a pit, field, or sometimes a hastily fenced square, surrounded by yelling townsfolk and mildly interested clergy. You'd be expected to fight until one of three things happened. Someone yielded, someone died, or someone passed out from blood loss and was quietly declared guilty for being bad at cardio. There were rules, of course, most of them ignored. No hitting after a yield, no foreign weapons, no biting, no attacks once someone was on the ground. But rules in this context meant suggestions. Judges rarely intervened unless someone died too quickly. The spectacle had to last at least until lunch. If you lost, your guilt was confirmed. Immediately, no appeals. The moment your face hit the mud and your lungs stopped working properly, everyone agreed the matter was settled. You were guilty, and if you weren't already dead, you'd be executed shortly afterward. Clean, efficient, horrifying. And if you won, that meant you were innocent, somehow. Never mind that you just caved in another man's head with a hammer. Justice had spoken. You walked free, probably limping, possibly bleeding, but free. Until the next accusation, at least. Some people hired champions to fight on their behalf. This was considered legal, logical even. If you couldn't fight because of age, injury, or an unfortunate lack of limbs, you could nominate someone else to do your dying for you. They didn't have to believe in your innocence, just in your coin purse. Champions were a gamble. Some were honourable professionals, others were drunk, or bought off, or confused about which side they were on. Still, better to pay someone who knows how to swing a sword than to try it yourself with a spoon and a dream. Trial by combat wasn't always deadly. Sometimes it ended with one party screaming for mercy and the other standing over them, panting and dramatic. The judge would declare a victor, the crowd would cheer or boo, and both parties would leave with at least one new concussion. But even if you won, the trauma lingered. You didn't win your case, and you just survived it. And everyone in town watched. They saw you fight. They saw you bleed. They saw you almost die over a stolen goose or a misheard insult in the tavern. Justice wasn't just blind. It was bloodthirsty. Eventually, the practice fell out of favour. People realised that maybe trial by brawl wasn't the pinnacle of fairness. But for centuries it persisted. A legal system that treated truth like a bar fight with fancier robes. So next time someone tells you they long for the good old days, remind them that those days involved settling court cases with mud, sticks, and a loose interpretation of divine will. Because nothing says due process like trying to dodge a sword while yelling, "I didn't do it." At some point during your trial, perhaps after the ordeal, perhaps after your very public loss in a mud pit sword fight, the court might decide that you're still not being cooperative enough. Maybe you're denying the charges a little too emphatically. Maybe you won't name accomplices. Maybe the priest just doesn't like your haircut. Time for a helpful little push. They call it interrogation. You know, with ropes and fire and a few implements that look like someone dared a blacksmith to make a chair out of nightmares. It's not about punishment. Not yet. It's about clarifying the truth, which is a nice way of saying, we're going to make you scream until you agree with us. First, you're informed that you don't have to be tortured. All you have to do is confess. Just say the words. Admit to the crime. Any crime. They're not picky. They'll let you stop whenever you want, assuming your mouth still works and you're not currently unconscious from shoulder dislocation. The rack is a favourite. It's simple, efficient, and horrifying. You're tied down and slowly stretched, inch by agonising inch, until your joints pop. Your limbs extend unnaturally, and your back starts asking hard questions about your life choices. You won't break immediately. That's the whole point. You're supposed to stew in it. Then there's the strappado. Hands tied behind your back, you're hoisted into the air by a rope, and then suddenly dropped. Not all the way, just enough to violently wrench your arms upward behind you. It doesn't break bones, it just tears everything that keeps them in the right place. Sometimes they prefer heat. A candle under your feet, a red-hot poker waved near your face, a branding iron pressed gently, or not so gently, to your leg. They tell you it's symbolic. You're being purified, you're not. You're being grilled like a slightly guilty ham. Thumb screws offer a more delicate experience. Your fingers or toes are placed between iron plates and cranked tight. It starts as discomfort, then pain, then a sound you didn't know your body could make. Some people confess after a minute, others last longer. Everyone ends up with hands that don't work properly anymore. Water torture is surprisingly popular. It's not the modern kind. This version includes forced consumption. Gallons and gallons poured down your throat, with a funnel until your stomach feels like a barrel about to burst. You can't breathe, you can't scream, you just gurgle and hope someone drops the cup. The iron boot is reserved for special cases. A metal casing is clamped around your leg. Then they start hammering wedges into it, one by one, crushing bone and tissue with every strike. You confess by the fourth wedge. If you don't, you probably can't speak anymore anyway, or they go the psychological route, isolation in darkness, sleep deprivation, being forced to listen to a monk chant at you for 12 straight hours while waving a dead chicken. That one's rare, but it happened. And yes, people confess to everything afterward, including crimes they couldn't spell. Torture wasn't about guilt or innocence, it was about compliance. And once it started, it didn't stop until someone gave up, which means the longer you held out, the worse it got. The court called it the pursuit of truth. You called it the pursuit of please just end this. If you confessed, the pain stopped. Temporarily. You'd be praised for your cooperation, maybe given a sip of wine, then sentenced anyway. After all, confession confirmed your guilt. If you didn't confess, well, clearly the devil gave you strength. So, execution it is. Some people confess just to make it end. Others confess things that weren't true, named names that didn't exist, or admitted to flying on broomsticks just because the priest said it would help. It didn't help. It never helped. But screaming for 5 hours does strange things to your decision-making skills. And just to be clear, this was all legal, official, blessed by church and crown alike. It was written down, approved, signed, and in some cases choreographed like a particularly cruel dance. No one stopped to ask if it worked. They just nodded along as someone passed around the branding tongs. You were never meant to win. Torture wasn't about revealing the truth. It was about proving that they could make you say whatever they wanted. And once you did, they wrote it down in shaky ink, stamped it with the judge's seal, and called the matter settled. So if you ever find yourself thinking, medieval justice wasn't that bad, just imagine holding a glowing iron bar while a man in robes asks whether your cow was in league with Satan. Because if the crime didn't break you, the interrogation would. Once the trial's over, or paused, or spiraled completely off the rails into burning pokers and aggressive theology, you're taken somewhere to wait. This somewhere is the dungeon. Not a metaphorical dungeon, a literal one. Cold stone, iron bars, despair so thick you can chew it. Welcome to your new home. Dungeons aren't prisons in the modern sense. They're not correctional facilities with bunk beds and sad meals. They're holes in the ground or carved into castle basements, often as an afterthought. They were designed for three things: darkness, suffering, and legally sanctioned neglect. The smell hits you first. It's hard to describe. Think feet, mould, old meat, wet cloth, and something vaguely sour that might be fermented hope. It's the scent of centuries, of people regretting their life choices. You don't get used to it. You just eventually stop crying about it. The air is thick, not metaphorically, literally. It doesn't move. It just sits there, damp and heavy, like the breath of a toad. Your lungs feel betrayed. Every inhale comes with the taste of moss, mildew, and the emotional residue of 600 prior tenants. Lighting is minimal. Maybe there's a torch in the hallway. Maybe. Usually, it's just you, darkness, and the occasional flicker of light from a guard's lantern. Far enough away to be taunting, but close enough to remind you that someone could check on you. They won't, but they could. The walls drip, constantly. You don't know where the water's coming from. Probably the ceiling, possibly the dead. It creates a constant, irregular plinking sound that slowly becomes your lullaby. Drip, drip, pause, drip. You start hearing patterns in it. Messages, warnings, existential threats from the wall fungus. You sleep on straw, not fresh straw, not even last week's straw. Just a grey, matted lump of formerly plant matter that squelches when you sit on it. Sometimes it moves. You tell yourself it's just your imagination. Then it blinks. Rats live here. Big ones, bold ones. They look you in the eye and assess your threat level. You lose that staring contest every time. They steal your food, your dignity, and occasionally a toe if you sleep too soundly. You start naming them. They don't respond, except for Gregory. He watches you while you sleep. Food comes irregularly. Bread so hard it could double as a blunt weapon. Stew made from mystery. If you're lucky, there's water. If you're unlucky, the guard forgot. Or remembered, and just doesn't like you. Hunger gnaws at you. Eventually, you try to eat the straw. Gregory judges you. Time stops meaning anything. There are no clocks, no windows, no routine. You mark the days by meals or rat sightings, or how many times you hallucinate your grandmother telling you to invest in wool futures. You forget what month it is, then what year, then your last name. You're not alone. Other cells hold other prisoners. You hear them, moaning, whimpering, talking to themselves, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering prayers in languages no one speaks anymore. You try to make friends. That goes poorly. One of them bites. Your clothes rot on your body. Your skin itches. Your feet are always damp. Your fingernails go strange colours. You develop a cough that sounds like a haunted accordion. No one checks. No one cares. You're not a person anymore. You're just part of the dungeon's ambience. Guards visit occasionally. They don't speak. They don't make eye contact. They throw things. Sometimes food, sometimes insults. Sometimes they forget to unlock the chamber pot. and you spend the day learning the many flavours of humiliation. You lose track of why you're here. You stop thinking about the trial, the judge, the crime, the goat. All you know is this place. This damp, gnawing, dripping box where hope goes to drown and rats form governments. Eventually, someone opens the door. Maybe to release you, maybe to execute you, maybe just to toss in another unfortunate soul. It doesn't matter. You no longer flinch. You no longer hope. You just blink at the light, cough once and welcome the next chapter in your slow-motion collapse. Because the dungeon isn't punishment. It's the waiting room for it. Eventually, the wheels of medieval justice stop grinding long enough to deliver a verdict. And if, by some miracle, you've escaped execution or extended dungeon rot, congratulations. It's time for punishment, not the quiet kind, not the solitary, reflective kind, the kind that happens outdoors, in front of people, while everyone throws things. Punishment wasn't just about making you suffer. It was about showing people that you suffered. Justice wasn't considered effective unless it came with screaming and a crowd. The pain was part of the message. The spectacle was the main event. You were the entertainment. Let's start with the stocks. A medieval classic. Your hands and head are locked into a wooden frame, and you're left standing, sitting, or awkwardly hunched in the town square. For hours, sometimes days, you can't move, you can't scratch, you can't shield your face from the sun, the rain, or the flying cabbage. Because yes, people will throw things, rotten vegetables, mud, animal dung, occasionally coins, but never the helpful kind. Children laugh, adults scoff, strangers insult your haircut. There's no real limit to how creative the town can get. Public shaming is a group activity. Then there's the pillory, similar to the stocks, but even worse for posture. Your neck and wrists are locked in place, leaving you upright and entirely too available for mockery. Bonus? Some towns let citizens walk right up and slap you. Open-handed, politely vicious. Whipping was a fan favourite. Delivered with flair, frequency, and very little concern for your skin's feelings. Sometimes done in the square, sometimes on a cart dragged through town. So everyone got a chance to admire your growing collection of red welts. Think parade, but with more blood. The tool of choice, the cat o' nine tails, a cheerful name for a multi-tailed whip designed to tear skin with maximum efficiency. Each lash cut deeper. After 10, you stopped counting. After 20, you stopped screaming. After 30, you stopped standing. For particularly annoying crimes, say theft, heresy, or looking at the magistrate's wife, you might be branded. A hot iron to the skin, usually on the hand, sometimes the face, a permanent reminder that you've been very naughty, and a convenient warning label for everyone else. Ear cropping was also on the menu. Commit the wrong crime, lose an ear. Commit it again, lose the other. No anesthesia, no apology, just someone with a knife and a questionable sense of accuracy. If you were lucky, you passed out. If not, you got to hear the whole thing. One last time. Nose slitting was another charming option, usually for repeat offenders or people who annoyed the wrong person. It was a deeply medieval way of saying, don't come back here. Effective, unsanitary, and guaranteed to make your next portrait slightly asymmetrical. And of course there was flogging at the cart's tail. You'd be tied to a wagon and dragged through the streets, whipped at every corner, like a particularly unpopular parade float. The goal was public humiliation and cardiovascular endurance. Most people failed both. Some punishments included tongue removal, for slander, or heresy, or just talking too much. It was a one-step solution to free speech problems. You went in with opinions. You came out with a lisp and a lifetime of eating soup. The worst part? None of this was considered cruel. It was normal, expected. People brought snacks. Children were encouraged to jeer. The community bonded over your blood loss. It was like a medieval trust fall. except instead of falling, you were being whipped in front of your neighbour's goat. Punishments weren't about rehabilitation. No one expected you to learn a lesson. They just wanted you marked, broken, and slightly less able to cause problems. If you cried, weak. If you screamed, guilty. If you stood there silently, bleeding and unblinking, suspicious, sometimes you were punished just enough to keep you alive and limping, a walking warning sign for the rest of the village. You became a conversation piece, a morality tale, a local landmark with scabs. And when it was done, when your sentence was served, you were released back into the world, sore, scarred, and utterly unemployable. Because nothing says welcome home like trying to reintegrate into society while missing both ears and your dignity. So yes, in medieval justice, the punishment always fit the crime. If the crime was existing near someone in power, and the punishment was community-organised torment. Well, here we are. The trial has failed you. The torture revealed nothing helpful, except how loud you can scream. The dungeon gave you mould-based lung diseases and a deep personal relationship with rats. And now, after all that, your sentence has arrived. Death. Public, theatrical, and deeply unhygienic. Execution isn't just punishment, it's entertainment. The townsfolk are buzzing. Children are excited. The baker's offering gallows day discounts on bread shaped like little nooses. You are, for lack of a better term, the main attraction. Everyone wants to see if you cry. Your journey begins with a shuffle out of the dungeon, blinking, sunburned, and smelling like wet despair. You're given a moment to repent. This involves a priest muttering in your general direction while you try not to vomit on your own shoes. The priest assures you that your soul is the real focus. The executioner assures you that your neck is. Speaking of which, meet the executioner. Large, hooded, smells like iron and meat. You never learn his name. You don't need to. His hobbies include sharpening axes, dramatic pauses, and whistling off-key. He's very good at his job. You'd be impressed if he wasn't holding your death in his hands, like a melon at market. You're loaded onto a cart and paraded through town. Slowly. Publicly. Everyone watches. Some throw things, some pray, some try to sell snacks. A few shout your name, or at least the name they think is yours. You've become folklore before you've even finished your final lap. The gallows loom in the distance, big, wooden, foreboding. It creaks ominously, because of course it does. There's a platform, a rope, and a crowd that's way too cheerful for what's about to happen. Kids are sitting on shoulders, vendors are shouting. It's basically a carnival, except the prize is your corpse. You're helped up the stairs, your legs barely work, your brain is foggy, your mouth is dry. You consider saying something poetic, a final statement to echo through history. But mostly, you manage a wheeze and maybe a curse involving the judge's hat. The crowd loves it. The executioner adjusts the noose like he's fluffing a pillow. He's done this before. A lot. You wonder if he's thinking about dinner, or your shoes, or absolutely nothing. He doesn't look at you. That would make it personal. This is just a job. You're just a neck. The rope goes tight. Not yet tight, just positioned. You try not to look down. It doesn't help. Someone in the crowd yells something inappropriate. You don't respond. You're trying very hard not to cry, scream, or soil yourself. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. The priest offers you last rites again. You nod, or blink, or twitch. It's enough. He starts praying. You try to follow along, but your brain is mostly playing funeral music and flashing memories of bread that didn't taste like mould. Then comes the signal. Maybe a drumbeat, maybe a hand wave, maybe just silence. The executioner pulls the lever, or kicks the stool, or pushes you off with a surprising amount of casual force. Gravity does the rest. If it's a short drop, you choke. A long drop, you snap. Sometimes the rope breaks. Sometimes the knot fails. Sometimes you twitch for a while, legs kicking like a fish that regrets everything. The crowd watches it all with morbid curiosity and mild applause. After a while, seconds, minutes, eternity, it ends. You're still. The priest says something solemn. The executioner shrugs. The crowd begins to disperse. A few stay behind, just in case something funny happens. And nothing does. You're dead. Thoroughly. They leave you hanging for a while. A warning, a message, a decorative statement about the cost of heresy, theft, or existing near someone important. Eventually, your body's taken down, maybe buried, maybe tossed in a ditch, maybe left to dangle until the birds lose interest. And that's it. Your medieval justice journey ends with a splintery platform, a suspiciously frayed rope, and the knowledge that you are slightly more popular in death than you ever were in life. Sleep tight, neck stretchy friend. History remembers you as some guy who got what was coming. It's your final moment. The rope is tied. The priest is muttering something half-hearted. Your stomach is doing backflips. But before we focus on your impending doom, let's take a look at the real star of medieval justice, the crowd. They showed up early. Some camped out. Others brought children. A few even dragged stools from home for a better view. This isn't just a punishment, it's entertainment. The medieval equivalent of dinner and a show, but with more blood and slightly fewer coherent plot lines. Vendors roam the square, selling roasted chestnuts, boiled ale, questionable pies and something that might be meat on a stick. Children chase chickens between people's legs. Someone's playing a lute badly. This is a festival of death, and you're the reluctant headliner. People aren't sad, they're excited. This is the most exciting thing to happen since last week's pig escaped into the church. Executions are community events, like weddings, but louder, and with more screaming. You've brought everyone together. You're a unifying tragedy. They don't care what you did. Theft? Heresy? Looking funny at a baron's wife? Doesn't matter. You're guilty because you're up there, and they're down here, eating turnips and judging your posture. It's not about justice, it's about the spectacle. There's always that one guy shouting, "Get on with it," like you're personally delaying his afternoon. Another yells, "Confess, sinner," while chewing something that sounds moist. Meanwhile, a toddler throws a crust of bread at your feet with the energy of a tiny, furious god. You scan the faces. Most are strangers. A few look vaguely familiar. That might be your neighbour, or the guy who stole your ladder last year. Hard to say. He's laughing too hard for proper identification. Eye contact is a mistake. You start to feel like a tourist attraction with a pulse. Some people genuinely believe they're watching justice. Others just want to see something messy. It's the perfect excuse to take the day off from farming. After all, how often does someone die theatrically in the middle of town? You're not just being executed, you're performing. The crowd's mood fluctuates. If you cry, they jeer. If you joke, they cheer. If you try to pray, someone heckles. They want drama. They want closure. They want to be able to tell their grandkids, "I was there when that guy soiled himself on the scaffold." Good times. And if the execution goes wrong, oh, then it really becomes a show. A botched hanging? That's a story for years. If you twitch, scream, or survive longer than expected, it's a 5-star matinee. The louder you suffer, the more they clap. Nobody came for a quiet death. Even the priest glances at the crowd more than at you. He knows he's part of the act. His job is to make it sound holy while the peanut gallery throws mouldy fruit. The executioner too, a crowd favourite. They admire his skill, his timing, his ability to kick a stool with flair. You hear laughter, applause, possibly betting. One man swears you'll faint. Another says you'll curse the king. They argue while you tremble. You are now a public debate topic with ankles. Your last words will be analysed like a bad play review. And after it's done, after the twitching stops and the rope goes slack, they'll murmur their thoughts. Bit quick. Should have screamed more. Did you see his face? Then they'll go home. Back to their chickens, their fields, their deeply average lives. while you hang there like a grim decoration. The crowd doesn't remember your name. They remember the moment, the noise, the drama. You weren't a person. You were a break in the routine, an afternoon event, and by sundown, you're already fading into legend, half remembered and wrongly quoted. Because in medieval justice, the crowd isn't just a witness, they're the jury, the gossip column, and the Yelp reviewer of your final moments. You brought them joy, in the most horrifying way possible, and you didn't even get a standing ovation. You're dead now. Congratulations. The rope did its job, the crowd had their fun, and the priest gave you a half-hearted blessing while checking the time. Surely, this is the end of your legal troubles, right? Wrong. You may be dead, but the justice system isn't done with you. Not by a long shot. Because in medieval law, being alive wasn't a requirement for punishment. If there was still something to take, they were taking it. Death was no excuse for dodging a good confiscation. Let's start with property. The crown wants it. Always has. If you were executed for a serious crime, treason, heresy, theft with flair, your land didn't go to your family. It went to the king. Instantly. No paperwork, no probate, no teary-eyed readings of your will. Just a bailiff with a seal and a very smug face. Your clothes? Confiscated. Your home? Gone. Your livestock? Rounded up. That donkey you loved like a brother? Now munching royal hay somewhere you'll never haunt. Medieval law treated death like a yard sale. Everything must go, especially if it belonged to someone recently executed. And if you had money hidden away, coins under floorboards, jewellery in a wall, that weird gold ring you swallowed during your arrest, tough luck. If they find it, it's forfeited. If they don't find it, they'll just assume you gave it to a heretic and burn someone else for good measure. But what if your family wants your body back? For a burial, a prayer, maybe just a hug? Too bad. Executed criminals weren't always returned. Sometimes they were buried in unmarked graves. Sometimes in consecrated ground, but only if someone powerful intervened. And sometimes they were left out, literally. Gibbeting was one popular post-mortem option. Your body would be placed in a metal cage and hung from a tall pole. For days, weeks, months, however long it took for birds, weather, and time to do their thing. You weren't just a warning, you were a decaying billboard for law and order. And if you were really unlucky, they'd cut off your head and display it on a spike. Tower walls, bridge gates, city entrances. Look what happens to criminals, the sign didn't say, because your face did the talking. Sunburned, shrivelling, judging every passing goose. Some corpses were even dug up after burial, if someone important decided they hadn't been punished enough. That's right, medieval justice had a sequel. Your bones could be put on trial, exhumed, cursed or burned. Because if there's one thing the system hates, it's unfinished vengeance. And if you'd been excommunicated or accused of heresy, your soul was considered very much still at risk. The church might deny you burial, or require you to be buried face down, or outside the cemetery walls, just in case you tried to escape purgatory with sass. In some cases, execution wasn't enough. You could be burned after hanging, or drawn and quartered before burial, just to make extra sure you weren't smuggling any dignity into the afterlife. There were procedures, horrible, messy procedures. Even if you were innocent, posthumously of course, you didn't get your stuff back. Your family might get a "we're sorry" scroll, maybe a slightly cleaner grave. But the land, the livestock, the coins, already absorbed into the royal stomach. And don't think anonymity will save you. If someone remembered your name, even years later, and decided you'd committed a crime before you died, your heirs could be punished. Debts demanded, reputations crushed. You weren't just guilty, you were generationally inconvenient. This wasn't justice, this was a clean-up operation, a message to the living. Cross the wrong people, and you won't even get to rot in peace. The law wanted closure. Your corpse was a loose end, and so they tied it up. With rope, with fire, with a lovely little plaque that said, "Here lies nobody important." So no, death wasn't the end. Not here, not now. In medieval justice, the body was just another thing to be processed. Stripped, displayed, denied, taxed, sometimes even retried. You died once. The law made sure it counted for at least 3. You didn't do anything. You know that. Maybe you stepped in the wrong puddle. Maybe you sneezed during a sermon. Maybe you looked at someone's goat for a second too long. And now, you're a criminal. Not because of what you did, but because of what someone thinks you did. In the medieval justice system, actual guilt was optional. Suspicion was plenty. Someone points, someone mumbles, someone says, "He always seemed odd," and suddenly you're being dragged before a judge because your haircut made a merchant's wife nervous during market day. False accusations were everywhere, like fleas but worse for your health. They started from gossip, fear, jealousy, or boredom. A neighbour wanted your field? Easy. Accuse you of stealing a chicken. A rival wants your job. Witchcraft, probably. That mole on your back? Definitely demonic. The law didn't require proof, just momentum. Enough whispers, and you were halfway to prison before you even heard what you were supposedly guilty of. The accusation was the evidence. The burden of proof sat comfortably on your shoulders, wearing iron shackles and a very sarcastic smile. Being well behaved didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. You were too quiet, too pious. You didn't gossip. You didn't drink. You minded your business, habillé, and that was suspicious. No one liked someone with clean hands and no vendettas. That's the behaviour of a heretic with something to hide. And once the rumour started, good luck stopping it. Denying only made it worse. Of course he denies it. That's what they do. Crying, manipulative, staying calm, definitely soulless. Laughing it off, a sure sign of guilt. There was no winning, only slower losing. Sometimes it wasn't even personal. A priest had a bad dream. A nobleman lost a bet. The stars were in a weird alignment. That's all it took. You were in the wrong place, at the wrong time with the wrong expression. And now you're standing in a courtroom being asked if you can sort with frogs. And if it wasn't frogs, it was Satan, or demons, or witches, or whatever vaguely blasphemous nonsense someone had decided was this season's moral panic. The weirder the accusation, the harder it hit. No one wants to burn a petty thief, but a man who cursed a baby's shadow, that's entertainment. You might try to mount a defence, witnesses, alibis, logic. Good luck. The judge heard the rumours too, from the tavern, from his cousin, from a guy who swears you once sneezed without crossing yourself. Besides, innocence wasn't the goal. Closure was. If you were lucky, you just got fined. If you were unlucky, they tied you to a post and asked how many devils you spoke with before breakfast. If you were really unlucky, you confessed, just to make it stop. And then they hanged you anyway. Justice doesn't like a spoiler. And no, the truth didn't come out later, or if it did, it came out quietly. Much too late. You'd already been whipped, branded, exiled, or buried. Someone might say, "Turns out he didn't do it." Then they'd shrug and go back to arguing over turnips at the market. False accusations weren't accidents. They were tools, weapons in petty rivalries, political games, church feuds, and the people who wielded them knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't need you to be guilty. They just needed everyone else to believe you might be. Your best defense? Social invisibility. Be boring. Be forgettable. Don't make waves. Don't own too much land. Don't own too little land. Don't talk too loudly. Don't stare too long at a priest's horse. Try not to stand out. Try not to stand at all. Because in a world where justice is based on volume, fear, and who had the worst day, being innocent isn't protection. It's a liability. It makes you smug, defiant, uncooperative, and the courts hate that. So if someone points a finger your way, and the crowd starts to murmur, and the judge starts sharpening his guilty face, remember, blinking suspiciously was your first mistake. Breathing was your second. The third? That'll be whatever you do next. Let's say you're lucky, or rather, theoretically lucky. Instead of being dragged before the king's justice or tossed in a ditch by the sheriff, you end up in ecclesiastical court. That's right, you're going to be judged by men of God. Surely this will be more fair, more merciful, more forgiving. Nope. Welcome to church court, where the outfits are fancier, the vocabulary is longer, and the punishments are just as horrifying, but with extra incense. You're not being tried by warriors or lords now. You're being tried by scholars, priests, monks, and sometimes a bishop who looks like he hasn't blinked since Advent. Your crime isn't necessarily theft or murder, though it could be. But more often it's heresy, blasphemy, sorcery, or something horrifying like refusing to pay a tithe or forgetting how many sacraments there are. You're not just wrong, you're theologically incorrect. And that's worse. The setting is different. Less screaming, more solemnity. You sit in a dim chamber beneath stained glass windows, surrounded by men who speak fluent Latin and regard your peasant vocabulary with barely concealed horror. They're writing things down. You don't know what. It might be your confession. It might be a grocery list. You'll never find out. There's no jury, just clergy. Often educated, often literate, occasionally drunk on power and actual wine. They ask you questions in Latin. You respond in panic. They frown, nod, and accuse you of speaking suspiciously like someone who might have once read a banned book. Evidence? Still optional. But now it's moral evidence. You once skipped Mass, you're suspicious. You couldn't recite the Lord's Prayer without stuttering. Clearly in league with the devil. Someone saw you talking to a cat. Well, now it's a familiar, and you're a wizard with poor social skills. If they're feeling merciful, they offer you a chance to confess. You're encouraged to repent, to prostrate yourself, to admit that you've erred and agree to do penance. Sounds nice, but the penance might be flogging, fasting for weeks, or walking barefoot across 6 towns reciting psalms while people throw cabbage at you. And if you don't confess, if you resist, the church has a solution for that too. It's called the Inquisition. Not the Monty Python kind, the real one. With robed men and official permission to torture you in ways that are technically not bloodletting, but absolutely bloodletting. Yes, church courts tortured people. They weren't supposed to kill you, not directly, but they could stretch you, starve you, burn you, and intimidate you until you said what they wanted. Then they handed you over to the secular courts to be executed. Because God loves a legal loophole. Once you confess, they record your statement in Latin, interpreted by people who may or may not have been paying attention, and that confession becomes your legacy. Not your name, not your good deeds, just that one time you allegedly said something weird about saints and crop failure. And heaven help you if you're found guilty of heresy. That wasn't just frowned upon, it was existential treason. You weren't just wrong, you were dragging souls toward damnation. That's how they saw it. And that's why they tied you to a stake and set you on fire to save you. You could appeal, in theory, but appeals went to Rome, and Rome took its sweet time. You might be dead before your parchment even made it past the Alps. Even if it did, the response was usually just a slightly fancier Latin letter saying, "Yeah, burn him." Even priests weren't safe. Say the wrong thing in a sermon, misquote scripture, or just look like you're enjoying life too much. Boom. Heresy investigation. Enjoy being interrogated by your own co-workers. It's like being audited by God, but meaner. And don't expect a proper burial if you're condemned. The church might excommunicate your corpse, deny you rights, burn your remains, or scatter your ashes somewhere inconvenient, like over a cesspit. Symbolism was important, so was petty vengeance. In the end, church courts weren't about truth. They were about control, about reinforcing doctrine, about reminding everyone that salvation had rules, and those rules were enforced by men who wore robes and took poor Latin grammar as a personal insult. So yes, you might avoid the sword, you might avoid the dungeon, but in the hands of church justice, your punishment comes wrapped in scripture, stamped with holy wax, and delivered by a man who truly believes that fire cleanses the soul, and he's got the matches ready. Let's talk about fairness, or rather, the complete medieval absence of it. Because while justice technically applied to everyone, what it actually meant depended heavily on what kind of shoes you wore. Leather boots with embroidery? Congratulations, you're above the law. Barefoot with frostbite? Hope you like amputation. If you were a noble and you committed a crime, the punishment was usually a fine, or a warning, or a strongly worded letter written in cursive Latin and sealed with a dramatic blob of wax. Sometimes you were told to go on pilgrimage, which is fancy talk for take a vacation and think about what you did. But if you were a peasant and you stole a loaf of bread, you might get whipped, branded, pilloried or executed, depending on the mood of the judge and how recently someone important had stubbed their toe. The law wasn't blind, it was just really good at squinting at bank statements. A noble could commit murder and still walk away with their lands intact and a small fee paid to the victim's family. A peasant could accidentally insult a goat and find themselves hanging upside down in a cage next to a sign that read, "Blasphemer." Both crimes, apparently, just very differently priced. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. Laws were written by nobles, for nobles, and interpreted by other nobles who shared cousins, debts, and dinner invitations. Meanwhile, peasants were treated like mildly intelligent livestock with occasional tax-paying abilities. Even the courts were different. Nobles were tried in manorial or ecclesiastical courts, where everyone wore velvet and pretended to care about due process. Peasants, hauled into town square, judged by someone who once failed out of preschool, and sentenced between lunch and sheep shearing. Punishments for nobles tended to be symbolic. A day in confinement, a public apology, a fine of 20 gold coins, which they found in their second-best wine drawer. Peasant punishments were practical, meaning painful, visible, and frequently sticky. Did a noble commit treason? They might be allowed to shave their head, wear a robe, and retreat to a monastery for a decade of sulky prayer. Did a peasant do the same? No robe, no monastery, just a one-way ticket to flaying, hanging, or being slowly roasted over a public fire for educational purposes. Even tax laws played favourites. Nobles could bribe, delay, or flat-out ignore their debts. Peasants paid in chickens, labour, and increasingly desperate size. Miss a payment? You lose your cow, or your house, or your spine, depending on how violent the local bailiff felt that day. Noble families had heraldry, lawyers, and cousins in the clergy. You had blisters, a fear of Latin, and maybe a rusty knife you used to cut turnips and defend your honour. Guess which side the court believed when there was a land dispute. And don't think the church was on your side either. Nobles funded chapels, sponsored pilgrimages, and occasionally donated a second son to the priesthood. You forgot to tithe one time and got called demon-kin by a monk with coffee breath and a grudge. Sometimes nobles got away with crimes so blatant that they became local legends. Remember when Lord Evergilt pushed a friar down a well and blamed it on wind? Peasants just nodded and hoped they wouldn't be next. Meanwhile, your cousin sneezes during a procession and ends up in the stocks with "witch" painted on his forehead. If a noble was punished harshly, it was usually because they angered another noble. Not because of the crime, but because of the embarrassment. Reputation was currency. You didn't get punished for hurting people, you got punished for making powerful people look bad. The logic was simple. Peasants were disposable. There were always more of them. Nobles were rare, valuable, and prone to marrying their own cousins, which apparently made them special. So the law protected them like precious, violent, inbred teacups. So yes, justice, technically, existed in the Middle Ages, but it wore fur-lined robes, drank imported wine, and only took bribes in denominations of cattle or silk. For everyone else, justice was a boot to the ribs and a stern reminder to know your place. And your place, definitely not in court with rights. If you thought medieval justice was bad, let's narrow the lens a little. Let's talk about what happened if you were a woman. Spoiler, it didn't get better. It got weirder, crueler, and much more flammable. Women in the Middle Ages had a unique legal status, somewhere between property and public menace. You could be judged not just for what you did, but for how you looked, what you said, or whether someone's goat got sick after you walked past it. Accused of witchcraft? Of course you were. All it took was a suspicious neighbour, a bad harvest, or a mole in the wrong spot. You knew herbs? That's poison. You didn't cry at a funeral? Cold-hearted? You cried too much? Hysterical. Congratulations, you're a witch. And once that accusation landed, logic was no longer invited. The court didn't want proof. It wanted confession. And if you didn't give it, they'd squeeze, twist, dunk, or roast it out of you. Because everyone knows the best way to detect a witch is to see if she survives drowning. If she floats, she's guilty. If she sinks and dies, innocent. But, dead. Didn't get accused of witchcraft? Don't relax. You could still be tried for adultery, talking back, or just being difficult. And difficult was broadly defined. Maybe you had opinions. Maybe you ran a business too well. Maybe you existed without permission. Even married life didn't protect you. Your husband could accuse you of almost anything, and the court would listen. You didn't cook fast enough. You didn't bear a son. You made a face during a sermon. Into the pillory you go, with a helpful sign around your neck that says, scold, shrew, or harpy. There was even a specific punishment tool for mouthy women, the scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over your head with a gag to silence your tongue. Public humiliation with bonus drooling. You couldn't speak, eat, or move without pain. But hey, at least you weren't on fire. In some towns, women could be flogged, shaved, or dragged through the streets for sexual misconduct. Men? Fined, maybe, if anyone noticed. The double standard wasn't just present, it was carved into law with a smug little flourish. Pregnancy didn't always help either. If you were accused of a crime, you might get a delay, not mercy. They'd wait until you gave birth and then execute you. Because nothing says civilized society like letting a newborn live just long enough to watch mum be hanged. If a woman killed her husband, even in self-defense, the court assumed it was premeditated. Why? Because a woman must have planned it, since she had no strength to act in passion. That's right, they managed to be sexist in two directions at once. And if a man killed his wife, it was often downgraded to a domestic matter. Sometimes he was fined, sometimes not. Sometimes the court nodded and said, "Wives can be troublesome." Everyone chuckled. The widow did not. Let's not forget inheritance laws. Women couldn't always inherit land, titles, or even their own dowries. If your husband died, his cousin might show up and kick you out. If you died, your belongings went to your male relatives. Your personal agency had an expiration date, usually puberty. Even in church courts where you might hope for spiritual fairness, women were judged more harshly for moral crimes. A man confessed to fornication, he repented. A woman, branded, exiled, or sentenced to lifelong public penance in a tunic made of shame. And yes, women did resist. They ran, hid, lied, fought. They joined outlaw bands, disguised themselves as men, fled to nunneries, but the system was against them. Every door had a priest behind it, every alley had a judge, and every accusation had a fire starter. In the end, medieval justice didn't just fail women, it targeted them. It made their bodies a battlefield, their voices a threat, and their survival a statistical fluke. If you made it to old age without being accused of witchcraft or moral decay, you deserved a trophy, or at least a decent chair. So if you ever feel nostalgic for the good old days, remember this. If you were a woman, those days might have ended with you tied to a stake, while the crowd roasted turnips and blamed you for the weather. Justice medieval style now with extra fire. You've been accused of a crime. It doesn't matter if you did it. The court thinks you did, and the rope's already being measured. You have two options: face justice, KR, or run. And if you're fast enough, smart enough, and desperate enough, you just might make it to the one loophole that offers hope: sanctuary. In medieval law, churches weren't just places to kneel and contemplate your sins. They were emergency safe zones, like spiritual timeout corners for the legally doomed. If you could reach a holy place before being caught, you could claim sanctuary, a temporary force field powered by God and reinforced by Latin. The trick: you had to get there, on foot, while being chased, possibly barefoot, probably bleeding, and definitely terrified. It was a race between you and whoever wanted your head. You sprinted past pigs, startled peasants, and judgmental nuns, all while yelling something like, "I claim sanctuary," in between wheezes. Once inside the church, you had to grab the altar, the cross, or a holy relic, something important looking, and hold on like your life depended on it. Because it did. As long as you were touching sacred furniture, you were officially off limits, mostly. The guards might still yell. They might still poke you with sticks. But technically, they couldn't kill you yet. Congratulations, you're safe. For now. The authorities couldn't drag you out without offending the church, and nobody wanted that paperwork. So they waited, outside, impatiently, like wolves around a prayer circle. Meanwhile, you got to sit, reflect, sweat profusely, maybe snack on communion bread if you were lucky and blasphemous. But here's the catch: sanctuary wasn't permanent. You didn't get to live in the chapel forever, like some holy raccoon. You had 40 days to pray, panic, and prepare your next move. After that, you had to choose: stand trial and likely die, or agree to exile, known as abjuring the realm. Exile wasn't glamorous. You confessed to your crime, whether you did it or not, and swore publicly to leave the country. You were given a walking route to a specific port, and you had to take it without deviation. If you turned left when the instructions said right, hanging. If you stopped for lunch in the wrong village, hanging. If you blinked too confidently at a tax collector, you guessed it, hanging. And once you reached the port, you were expected to leave immediately. Doesn't matter if there was a ship, doesn't matter if you had money. The law assumed you'd hop onto the next vessel, sail away, and never return. If you did come back, well, the noose missed you. Of course, this all relied on people respecting the sanctuary system, which didn't always happen. Sometimes, angry mobs dragged people out anyway. Sometimes, knights accidentally set fire to the church. Sometimes the local priest decided you looked a bit too heretical and offered you up like a sacrificial goose. And the system was wildly inconsistent. Different churches had different rules. Some only protected certain crimes. Others required a donation. Some just locked the doors and pretended no one was home. The success of your sanctuary claim often depended on how much the priest liked you, or whether he had lunch plans. But still, for the desperate and the doomed, it was a chance. A slim one. A sweaty, uncomfortable, deeply humiliating chance. You might survive. You might be exiled instead of executed. And honestly, that counted as a win. Being an outlaw meant more than just on the run. It meant being legally dead. Once declared an outlaw, you lost all rights. Anyone could rob you, stab you, or drag you to court, and no one would be punished. You were fair game. A walking crime magnet with a target painted on your soul. So sanctuary was more than a delay tactic. It was a lifeline in a system that didn't hand out many. It was a final roll of the dice before the gallows noticed your name. A chance to kneel in a pew and beg for mercy from a God who might, just maybe, be slightly more forgiving than the sheriff. In the end, sanctuary didn't prove the system worked. It proved that everyone knew it didn't. That even in a world of floggings and flayings, there needed to be a back door. even if it was made of old wood and Latin hymns. So if you're ever wrongly accused, bleeding, barefoot, and clutching a holy statue while knights shout outside, congrats. You found the medieval version of due process. Good luck. You've got 39 days left. Let's be clear. In a proper justice system, a confession is supposed to mean something. It's the truth, spoken freely. A moment of clarity, accountability, maybe even redemption. In the medieval justice system, a confession was just whatever came out of your mouth before you passed out. If the court wanted one, they got one, not because you were guilty, but because you were tired, terrified, and possibly being held upside down over a fire while a monk asked you very leading questions. Medieval law prized confessions. They were considered the gold standard of guilt. If you confessed, the trial was basically over. No need for further investigation. No need for witnesses. No need for that pesky thing called evidence. Just a neatly written statement in Latin, signed with your name or, if you couldn't write, your blood. Of course, nobody cared how they got it. Sometimes the court was subtle. They'd isolate you, deprive you of food, keep you awake, surround you with priests who asked the same question over and over until you forgot what words meant. After a few days of that, you'd confess to anything just to see sunlight again. Other times, they skipped the subtlety and went straight to enhanced interrogation. That's a fancy way of saying torture. You'd be racked, crushed, burned, dunked or stabbed until your body screamed louder than your mouth. And once your mouth joined in, they'd call it justice. Confess to a crime you didn't commit. That's your problem. The court wasn't interested in regrets. Once it was written down and read aloud by a clerk who pronounced your name wrong, it became gospel. And if you later said, "Wait, I was in a lot of pain and possibly missing a kneecap when I said that," the court would nod sagely and say, "Then it must have been sincere. Sometimes you weren't tortured. Sometimes you were just tricked, promised leniency, promised food, promised you could clear your name if you just told the truth." Which is hilarious because the truth usually meant whatever story made the judge stop sighing. And let's not forget group confessions. One guy breaks under pressure. He names names. Those people are brought in. They break. They name more names. Before long, the whole village is allegedly in a pagan cult led by a goat named Jeremy, and it all started because someone coughed weird at mass. Were there false confessions? Absolutely. So many that historians now treat most medieval court records with the same skepticism reserved for treasure maps drawn in crayon. Entire trials were built on nonsense. A woman said she rode a broom, a man said he turned into a wolf, a baker said he flew. No one asked, why? They just said, that tracks. If you were lucky, your confession came early and without torture. If you were unlucky, they got creative. Hot coals, thumb screws, iron boots, the pair of anguish. Look it up or don't. It's worse than it sounds. All designed to help you find the truth by exploring your pain threshold. Even children weren't safe, small enough to be intimidated, old enough to be blamed. They confessed under pressure. Parents confessed to protect them. Siblings confessed for revenge. The court wrote it all down like a particularly gruesome bedtime story and said, case closed. And if you refused to confess, they just assumed you were guilty anyway. Because why else would you resist? Innocent people had nothing to fear, except, everything about this system. Even priests encouraged confession, not spiritual ones, but legal ones. Better to confess and die cleansed than to deny and burn dirty. There's nothing quite like being told, lie so your soul can be honest. And on rare occasions, someone confessed willingly. Guilt, madness, despair, who knows? But even then, the court would say, we'd like that in writing, after a little discomfort, just to make sure you really mean it. So yes, confessions were important in medieval justice, not because they were true, but because they were efficient. A confession ended the paperwork, ended the trial, ended you. And once you gave it, they could finally do what the system was built for, all along. Punish someone. Doesn't really matter who. Nothing says civilized society like turning death into a day out. In the medieval world, justice wasn't just about order. It was about spectacle, a performance, a social event with high stakes, loud noises, and occasional projectile vomiting. Public executions were appointment viewing. Everyone showed up. The lord, the priest, the guy who sells fried root vegetables. Children, obviously, because what better way to teach them about morality than watching a stranger slowly expire while Dad yells, "He deserves it," through a mouthful of parsnip crisps. These weren't quiet affairs. They were carnivals of cruelty. The accused was dragged into the square, filthy, terrified, sometimes half naked, always regretting their last 12 decisions. The crowd formed early, jockeying for spots with the best view. People saved stumps to stand on. Others climbed rooftops. One guy brought a ladder and sold seats. Vendors loved execution day. You could buy beer, snacks, cheap trinkets, and, in some towns, souvenirs. Tiny wooden gallows, dolls of the condemned. I saw the hanging pins. Some places turned it into a festival, complete with music. Imagine being disemboweled while someone plays a cheerful jig on a lute. That's medieval ambience. The executioner, local celebrity, equal parts butcher, judge, and circus act. He had a hood, an axe, and a flair for the dramatic. Sometimes he gave speeches. Sometimes he cracked jokes. Other times, he just raised his blade and let the crowd do the screaming for him. They always obliged. And oh, the crowd, they loved it. They cheered for the swing of the axe. They laughed when someone fainted. They booed if it wasn't bloody enough. Executions weren't about justice. They were about catharsis. All the frustration of peasant life channeled into one poor soul's final gurgle. Some executions came with pre-show entertainment. Floggings, brandings, or the stocks. Warm-up acts, basically. You could throw fruit, yell insults, or just enjoy the schadenfreude of watching a neighbour get what was coming to them. Or what someone vaguely claimed was coming to them. Hanging, classic. Decapitation, popular but tricky. Sometimes it took more than one swing. Burning, dramatic, slow, ideal for heretics, drawing and quartering. That was premium entertainment. High effort, lots of screaming. Rare enough to make people cancel plans. The church didn't object. In fact, it sometimes helped organise the event. Priests were on hand to bless the dying, sermonise to the crowd, and remind everyone that this was a merciful act. You know, setting someone on fire to cleanse their soul. Very compassionate. Kids grew up watching executions like modern kids grow up watching cartoons. It was normal, expected. You'd nudge your friend and say, "I heard this guy stole a horse." Then you'd both watch him beg for forgiveness and scream as they lit the kindling under his feet. Afterwards, you'd play executioner with sticks in the mud. Childhood. Some towns advertised executions in advance. "Come Thursday, see the butcher of Bramble Lane swing." Crowds travelled in from nearby villages. It was free. It was loud. It was morally educational in the worst possible way. And the condemned? They knew the show was part of the sentence. You didn't just die, you performed. Some went quietly, some ranted, some sang hymns. One guy famously cursed the mayor, the priest, and the chicken that had startled him earlier that morning. The crowd cheered like it was a farewell tour. Executions served a purpose, they said. Deterrence. "Let this be a lesson," said the man, waving a severed head at a crowd of children. But let's be honest, most people didn't leave resolved to be better. They left thinking, at least it wasn't me. Because the lesson wasn't about right and wrong. It was about fear, about reminding everyone what happens when you question the system, when you steal, when you speak, when you exist too loudly. So yes, justice medieval style. Less a process, more a performance, with snacks and screaming, and just enough blood to stain your memory forever. Don't forget to bring the kids, and there you have it, the medieval justice system, in all its blood-soaked, goat-blaming glory. A world where trials involved fire, guilt was a community sport, and your best legal defense was, please don't. It wasn't fair, it wasn't kind, it wasn't even coherent, but it was consistent, in that everyone eventually screamed. But you? You're not on trial, not in a freezing stone room, not being dunked in a pond because your neighbour thinks your bread rose too quickly. You're not trying to memorise the Lord's Prayer while someone sharpens iron tongs behind you. You're in bed, maybe even under a weighted blanket, with pillows, with plumbing, with dignity. You have rights, laws, due process, lawyers who don't scream Latin at you, judges who, mostly, stay awake. And if someone accuses you of witchcraft today, they get laughed off Twitter instead of promoted to the bishopric. That's progress. So take a breath, let your muscles relax. Feel the comfort of not being shackled to a wall while someone debates whether or not to boil your feet. You're clean. You're safe. You're probably not being hunted for heresy by a man named Brother Elbow. Close your eyes. Sleep well. And the next time you worry about that email you forgot to send, just remember, at least you're not in the pillory while a child pelts you with onions and calls you Satan's housekeeper. Perspective is everything.